The church has been going to war, that is, allowing its members to go to war and kill people, has been engaged in capital punishment for about 1,700 years, 1,800 years maybe, at least. And of course, what you're raising is the question of, well, how can the church go on for 1,800 years and do something that is contrary to the teachings of Jesus? The Holy Spirit must be guiding the church. It couldn't let the church go on for 1,800 or 1,700 years with something that was not of God and not of Jesus, because the Holy Spirit is with the church. Well, that's true. There's a truth in that, in the sense that the Constantinian Alteration of the church has produced an unending history of victims of war who are Christian and victims of war who are caused victims by Christians. And that is happening for the last 1,700 years. So that part's true. Christians have been probably the most violent group of people on the face of the earth in the last 1,700 years. That is, they've killed more people in war than any other group. But that doesn't answer the question. Because the church is doing something for 1,700 years or so does not mean that it's moral, does not mean it's the will of God. Remember, the church engaged in the Inquisition, the burning of heretics and the burning of Jews at the stake. From approximately 1288, when the first Jew was burnt at the stake in Troyes, France, to 1826, when the last Jew was burnt at the stake in Valencia, Spain. That's 600 years of burning Jews and heretics at the stake. Was that the Holy Spirit guiding the church? And during every one of those years, every one of them, there was hardly a soul that said anything. Not bishops, not popes, not theologians, not Thomas Aquinas, no one. In fact, Thomas Aquinas justifies it in his understanding of God. Was that the Holy Spirit guiding the church? 1,700 years? 600 years of Inquisition? Suppose we consider the church not in terms of this particular form of the institution, but the community that Christ founded to follow him and selects people to follow him in, as not something that is judged by the standards of time in the sense that we normally think of time. In other words, 1,700 years is a long time. But 1,700 years is not even a drop in the temporal bucket in terms of the 13.7 billion years the universe has been in existence, and the billions upon billions of years that we don't know into the future. The church is young. The church is a baby. The church was just born on Pentecost Sunday. If we took the entire 13.7 billion years that we know has existed since the Big Bang, there may be more behind that and so forth, but that we are sure of. If we took those 13.7 billion years, broke them down into 1 year, downsized them into 1 year, where the Big Bang occurs on January 1st at 12 o'clock, Jesus would have been born on December 31st at 11:59:58 p.m. 2 seconds ago. 2 seconds ago. 2,000 years in our times is equivalent of 2 seconds. We would have been born less than a second ago. we live for only a second. If the church, as is our belief, the church is supposed to go on in time and space unto eternity, then 600 years is a drop in the bucket. And the time eventually came after 600 years. It came. When the Holy Spirit was able to work through the sin and the concupiscence of people and release them from the desire, and more important, the sense that it was God's will that the church burn human beings, Jews and heretics at the stake. The Holy Spirit was working. But the Holy Spirit has to work through human beings in their freedom. Likewise, for almost 2,000 years, the church has said slavery was acceptable. At one time, you could have been put to death for saying that slavery was inconsistent with natural law in the 1700s. Up until 1954, in Catholic manuals with imprimatas, slavery was said to be an acceptable moral option. But in 1996, John Paul II said, slavery is always and in every case intrinsically grave evil, mortal sin. Which of us would think of burning a Jew at the stake today? Which of us would think of burning a heretic at the stake? Which of us would think of having a slave or slaves? The last pope to have a slave was Pius IX. Had two of them. But we know, regardless of whether Pius IX had a slave, regardless of whether people in the institutional church justified slavery for whatever reason, our question is, what would Jesus do? Would Jesus do this? This is not questioning the sincerity of Thomas Aquinas or anyone else. What it is saying is that once we take our focus spiritually as Christians off of Jesus, off of his way and his way of doing things, and we start finding loopholes and exceptions, and we start finding ways to cut corners and get around it, in order to what? In order to satisfy some need or whatever we want on earth, not in heaven, on earth, then it just opens a floodgate. Just opens a floodgate. We are today in the churches of Christianity, a lot of them, millions of people are getting abortions thinking it's consistent with the gospel. In other churches of Christianity, tens of thousands of people are killing people, hand over fist in wars, day in and day out. And they think it's consistent with following Jesus, loving as Christ loved. In parts of Christianity, people are burning people to death in electric chairs, decapitating them, poisoning them to death. And the best and the brightest of the Christians in those societies think this is all right and they can follow Jesus. You and I can't change anyone but ourselves. What is placed before us here is, if loving as Christ loved is the moral norm, the moral norm of the gospel, then we have to ask ourselves, would Jesus, even though the church is engaged in war for 1,700 years or more, did Jesus engage in war? Would Jesus have engaged in war? Is there anything in the gospel, any directions on Jesus about the legitimacy of engaging in war? Or is the gospel very clear? Violence and enmity are not part of the way of Jesus. It's your conscience. Not some persons that lived 1,500 years ago or 1,700 years ago. You, not them, will have to stand before God and say, this is what I saw as the truth of Jesus in terms of the phenomena of war, capital punishment, and abortion.